Somewhere in a brightly lit lab in Texas, scientists are engineering something that sounds completely impossible. They want a normal, everyday chicken to lay an egg that hatches into a dodo. Here is how it works. They take specific cells from a Nicobar pigeon, which is the dodo's closest living relative, edit the DNA, and inject them into a chicken. So, yeah. A chicken giving birth to an extinct bird. It sounds absurd. But here is the thing. The dodo was wiped off the map over 300 years ago, dying out completely alone on a tiny rock in the Indian Ocean. And today, biotech companies are pouring millions of dollars into dragging it back from the dead. So how exactly do we get from a lost bird in the 1600s to a high-tech genetic laboratory today? I am going to walk you through exactly how this is happening step by step. But first, we have to look at how the bird actually vanished. Because the official history books, they are missing a massive piece of the puzzle. To understand the sheer scale of what they are trying to rebuild in that lab, we have to rewind. Picture the map. Mauritius sits completely alone in the Indian Ocean, roughly 900 kilometers east of Madagascar. This isn't just some sandy beach. It is a rugged, volcanic island that violently erupted out of the ocean floor about 8 million years ago. For almost all of its existence, human footsteps simply didn't exist here. It was a blank slate of tangled, dense rainforest, rugged mountain peaks, and coastal plains completely untouched by mammalian predators. And on an isolated island with no humans and absolutely no large predators, evolution does something really interesting. It relaxes. The ancestors of the dodo didn't start out as giant, ground-dwelling birds. They were actually flying pigeons. Millions of years ago, a flock of these ancient pigeons likely got blown off course during a massive storm system in the Indian Ocean. They drifted over the water, landed on this volcanic rock, and found a world with absolutely zero threats. The food was just sitting right there on the forest floor. There were fallen fruits, nuts, and seeds scattered everywhere across the dirt. Over countless generations, these birds got larger and heavier to store more fat and energy. They eventually stopped flying entirely. Honestly, why waste the massive amount of biological energy it takes to grow and maintain large flight wings when absolutely nothing is trying to kill you? It is an incredibly efficient evolutionary strategy for an isolated environment. Let me ask you, if you lived in a place where literally nothing ever chased you, wouldn't you stop running too? Tell me what you think in the comments. So, by the time the first Dutch ships arrived in 1598, the dodo stood about a meter tall and weighed up to 20 kilograms. And here is where we need to clear something up, because almost everyone gets this part of the historical record completely wrong. For centuries, we pictured the dodo as this clumsy, bloated, almost comical creature. A joke of an animal that was just too dumb to survive. We invented a cartoon, and then we mistook the cartoon for the truth. Those famous historical paintings you always see in textbooks. They were mostly based on overfed, highly stressed captive birds that had been shoved into wooden crates, subjected to poor diets, and taken back to Europe on grueling sea voyages. The artists were painting miserable, captive animals, not the wild apex foragers of the Mauritian ecosystem. Modern studies of actual dodo bones tell a completely different story. Paleontologists have recently put dodo skeletons through advanced three-dimensional biomechanical scanning, and the real animal was lean, highly athletic, and surprisingly fast on its feet. Its leg bones were incredibly robust, designed to navigate the dense, rocky, and tangled forests of the island at high speeds. It possessed a large, powerful beak capable of snapping thick branches and cracking tough seeds. It wasn't stupid. It was simply perfectly adapted to a very specific, perfectly balanced world. But that perfect isolation was actually a lethal trap. When wooden ships finally broke the horizon at the end of the 16th century, the rules of survival changed overnight. In 1598, a Dutch expedition led by Vice Admiral Wybrand van Warwick landed on the shores of Mauritius. When those hungry sailors stepped off their ships, they saw a walking buffet. The birds had absolutely no concept of predators, so they didn't run away. Humans definitely hunted them, knocking them on the head with clubs for fresh meat after months at sea. But the sailors were just a distraction. The human hunting was bad, but it wasn't enough to cause an entire extinction event on an island covered in deep mountainous forests. The real devastation came crawling out of the cargo hold. Rats. Pigs. Cats. Macaques. An entire wave of invasive predators poured off those wooden decks and into a pristine forest that had never seen them before. And this is where that relaxed evolution turned completely fatal. Because nothing had threatened them for thousands of years, dodos nested right on the ground. They literally just laid a single egg in the open on the forest floor. No camouflage. No high branches to keep it safe. Think about it from the ground level. An adult dodo could easily sprint through the dense brush and escape a tired, scurvy-ridden sailor carrying a heavy musket. But a black ship rat doesn't need to outrun an adult dodo. It just waits in the shadows until the mother bird walks away to find food. A single pair of rats can produce over 1,000 descendants in a single year, flooding the ecosystem with hungry mouths. The adult birds weren't wiped out in some massive, dramatic hunting spree. The extinction was much quieter, much more insidious than that. The next generation was simply being eaten before it ever had a chance to hatch. Feral pigs would bulldoze through the ground nests, eating the eggs and crushing the chicks. Macaques would raid them from above. It was a slow, crushing squeeze from every direction. The coastal forests were being ripped down by settlers for ebony wood, the adults were being chased by imported hunting dogs, and the babies were being devoured in the shell. But even with all of this happening, the dodo didn't end cleanly. There was no final, dramatic stand. There is no historical logbook marking the death of the exact last bird on a specific Tuesday. Instead, it just disappeared into the fog. The last officially recognized sighting of a living dodo happened in 1662. A shipwrecked Dutch sailor named Volkert Evert spent time stranded on a tiny islet just off the coast of Mauritius. He wrote down in his personal logs that he saw them, chased them across the rocks, and even caught a few with his bare hands. After that exact account, nothing. No bodies, no nests, no reliable records. But if you look closer at the historical timeline, the story gets incredibly murky. Because the confirmed sighting right before that shipwrecked sailor? It was 24 years earlier. Think about what that actually means for the timeline of extinction. For almost a quarter of a century, European settlers were building permanent farms, hunting wildlife, and cutting down massive swaths of forest. They were writing detailed letters home, keeping strict colonial records, and yet nobody recorded a single confirmed dodo encounter. The bird wasn't being actively watched as it died. It was just slipping through the cracks of human attention. When we hear the word island, we usually think of a flat, sandy rock where you can stand on one side and see all the way to the other. But Mauritius is heavily mountainous. The interior is tangled, dense, full of deep ravines, and back in the 1600s, it was almost completely unexplored by the Europeans who were just clustered in little wooden settlements on the coastline. Finding a quiet bird in that kind of unforgiving terrain is like finding a needle in a massive, uncharted haystack. So, the obvious question practically writes itself. If a large bird could secretly survive for 24 years without a single human seeing it, just hiding in the dense brush of the mountains, what was stopping them from hiding out for another 30, 50, or even 100 years? That exact question is what two researchers decided to answer, not with jungle expeditions, but with raw mathematics. Here is the problem that constantly haunts extinction science. A sighting proves an animal is alive, but the absence of a sighting proves almost nothing. You simply can't see something that isn't being actively looked for. So in 2003, researchers David Roberts and Andrew Solo published a massively influential paper in the scientific journal Nature. Instead of just treating that 1662 shipwreck sighting as the final curtain, they took all the historical sightings and treated them as scattered data points across time. They ran those points through a complex probabilistic framework based on the timing of the most recent sightings. They used statistical probability math to estimate when the gaps between human encounters would realistically stretch to infinity. They calculated when the last bird actually died, rather than just relying on when the last one was seen by a human being. Their answer was 1690. That is nearly 3 decades after the last confirmed sighting. Almost 30 years where, according to the math, dodos were still walking the tangled forests of Mauritius, still nesting, still surviving, and absolutely nobody wrote down a single word about it. Now, part of you wants it to still be out there, right? If they survived 30 years past their supposed death, why couldn't a handful of them be hiding in an untouched valley today? But here is the harsh, uncomfortable wall of reality. Mauritius today is not a lost, untouched world. It is a densely populated modern nation. It has massive commercial sugar cane farms, heavy road networks, luxury resorts, and well over 1 million people living on an island of roughly 2,000 square kilometers. Every accessible corner of that rock has been walked, mapped, farmed, or built on. Remember, the dodo was 1 meter tall. It nested on the ground. A large, ground-walking bird leaving absolutely 0 bones, 0 feathers, and 0 trace for over 3 centuries isn't a cool survival story. It is a physical impossibility. The verdict is hard, but it is clear. The wild dodo is gone. It has been gone for a very long time, and nothing is coming out of those remaining forests. But that is not where this story ends. Because when the door on the wild dodo completely closed, human ambition stepped in to pry an entirely new one open. Forget the muddy shores of the 1600s. We are jumping straight back to that brightly lit, heavily funded laboratory in Texas. A biotechnology company called Colossal Biosciences realized something fundamental. If the dodo couldn't survive the human timeline, then humans were just going to have to rewrite the timeline completely. Scientists recently achieved something incredible. They fully sequenced the dodo's entire genome. They extracted highly degraded DNA fragments from a remarkably well-preserved museum specimen housed in Copenhagen. They essentially pieced the genetic code back together like a billion-piece jigsaw puzzle. With that complete genetic map in hand, they finally confirmed exactly what they were working with. The dodo's closest living relative is the Nicobar pigeon, which is a stunning, iridescent bird that lives across the islands of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The plan was ambitious but clear. They would use the Nicobar pigeon's genome as a base scaffold, and heavily edit it, gene by gene, until the genetic code perfectly matched the ancient dodo. But immediately, they hit a massive biological wall. Here is the huge complication with bringing back an extinct bird. Mammal embryos grow inside a fluid-filled womb, where scientists can easily reach them with microscopic needles to tweak the DNA during early development. But birds grow inside a hard, calcified shell. The embryo sits right on top of a massive yolk, and the biological process is completely sealed off. Effectively, nature locks scientists out of the process the moment that shell forms in the oviduct. You can't just drill a hole in an egg and start injecting DNA without destroying the incredibly fragile structure inside. If you never realized how much harder it is to clone a bird than a mammal, hit the like button. It completely changes how you look at the limits of genetics. The researchers were staring at an impossible biological lock. They couldn't use the same standard cloning techniques that gave us Dolly the sheep. So, they decided to hijack the entire process before the eggshell even existed. Instead of trying to edit a fully formed egg, they went after something called primordial germ cells. Primordial germ cells are the foundational, base-level cells in a developing embryo that eventually migrate through the blood and develop into sperm and eggs. The strategy was absolutely wild, but scientifically sound. They decided to extract these primordial germ cells from the Nicobar pigeon. Once they had these specific cells isolated in a petri dish, they could apply their precise genetic edits to make the DNA sequence more dodo-like. They used tools like CRISPR to cut out specific pigeon traits and paste in the extinct dodo traits. Once the cells were heavily edited, they would inject them back into surrogate chickens. But these aren't just any regular farm chickens. These chickens have been specifically genetically engineered so they don't produce any germ cells of their own. They are essentially sterile. The surrogate chicken just becomes a living biological vessel, creating what scientists call a germline chimera. The ultimate goal is that this normal-looking chicken grows up, mates, and lays a fertilized egg. But because of those injected, edited cells carrying the ancient DNA, the biological material developing inside that shell won't be a chicken. The thing that breaks out of the shell will be a dodo. And this isn't just some sci-fi theory drawn up on a whiteboard. It is actually working right now in real time. Scientists have already successfully grown these specialized primordial germ cells from pigeons in a lab, which is a massive breakthrough on its own. Breeding colonies of Nicobar pigeons are currently active in the United States. Significant funding has been secured to push the project across the finish line, and advisory committees have already been formed to prepare for the day the bird is returned to the exact forests in Mauritius that it was erased from. But I promised you the honest answer, not just the marketing hype. We are still years away from a living, breathing bird actually walking out of a laboratory. The engineering is incredibly complex, and there are countless microscopic variables that could go wrong during embryonic development. And when it finally does happen, critics in the scientific community raise a really sharp, undeniable point. What steps out of that shell won't be a true, 100% original dodo. It will be a gene-edited proxy. It will be a highly engineered pigeon built from scratch to perfectly resemble a creature no living person has ever actually seen. It will look like a dodo, and hopefully act like a dodo, and fill the exact same ecological niche as a dodo, but its core biological code was written in Texas, not naturally evolved in the Indian Ocean. Which loops us right back to the beginning. If what hatches isn't exactly the historical bird that died 300 years ago, what does this whole story actually mean for us? For centuries, the dodo was the ultimate punchline. It was the poster child for being completely helpless, a tragic victim of a system it didn't understand, completely overrun by forces that rigged the game against it from the second those Dutch ships landed. When you look at the modern world, it is easy to feel exactly the same way. We look at the environmental damage we have caused, the countless species we have lost forever, and the permanent mistakes of the past, and it feels like the timeline is permanently closed. It feels like we just have to accept a broken world where everything good just eventually fades away. But this is exactly why the dodo's return matters so much. Science looked at an absolute, permanent defeat, an extinction from over 300 years ago, and decided to build a workaround. They couldn't clone it the normal way, so they found a brilliant biological loophole. They bypassed the shell. They rewrote the genetic code. They looked at a rigged game and changed the rules. You don't have to simply accept the ending that was written by the past. Whether it is restoring a destroyed forest, cleaning up a polluted ocean, or resurrecting an extinct bird from scattered fragments of DNA, the lesson is exactly the same. You find the workaround. You build the proxy. You take the pieces you have left, and you engineer a brand new reality. Stories about human ingenuity, wild science, and engineering a massive comeback from absolute zero, that is exactly what we explore here. Hit subscribe right now, because the next story we are covering is about an underdog predator that didn't just survive extinction, it completely outsmarted us. I will see you on the next one.